In violence and in war, we oftentimes find principles or concepts that are in tension with one another. And in violence, as in war, two concepts that we know to stand in tension with each other are proportionality and utility. If you were to be able to achieve ultimate victory by exterminating all life of the opposing, let's call it force or army or people, would it indeed be moral? And what does this reflection do on how we think about how and also why we train? There is oftentimes we will begin from some assertion that we ought to train because of the potentiality of using actions in self-defense. But I think there's actually another layer, much deeper, much more corporate, to the importance of a populace being at least somewhat versed in the capacity of the use of force. It's not so simple that you could pacify a people and thus make them good. In fact, maybe we might ask the question of, is a passive people capable of goodness? But let's start with a passage from Killing in War by Jeff McMahan. On page 19, he writes, "Proportionality is a constraint on action that causes harm. In most cases, for an action that causes harm to be justified, it must be instrumental to the achievement of some valuable goal against which the harm can be weighed and assessed. If the assessment is favorable, the harm is proportionate. If it is unfavorable, the harm is disproportionate. For liability to be an issue, the goal sought must usually be a solution to a problem. The principal condition of a person's being liable to being harmed in the pursuit of the goal is that he or she be implicated in some way in the existence of the problem. If a person is implicated in the existence of a problem in such a way that harming him in a certain way in the course of solving the problem would not wrong him, then he is liable to that harm. This is important because liability is one of two factors that affects the demands of proportionality. The other is intention. In different combinations, liability and intention yield four distinct proportionality requirements governing action in war." And he goes on to say, "I will call the goal of an act of war a war aim. When a person is implicated in a problem to which a certain war aim is the solution, so that he could be liable to suffer some degree of harm in that if that were necessary to achieve the war aim, we can say that he is potentially liable to be harmed in the pursuit of that aim." But I began his section on proportionality is a constraint on action that causes harm. And with that, we're going to take a moment to thank this show's sponsor, because Obsidian Arms has been the first sponsor of the Redacted Culture Cast. Now, you may have heard me talk about them a few times. If you're a dedicated listener, you know that Obsidian Arms produces a set of tools and punch kits that are particular to the gunsmith, whether you are professional or of the garage variety. However, I want to reiterate, as I've been working more in the garage over Memorial Day weekend, that there is a certain comfort in knowing that so long as I am using the tools, I know that I have a warranty on them if I have any issues. But even to this time, I have only been using them for a couple of months and have never approached the need to do so. So having the right tool for the right job will make it quite easier, whether you're assembling a BRN 180 or you are working on something a little bit more finesse implying. But then you can also head over to Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com and look at their ability to take your creations, your concepts, and bring them to life. And so if you want to do that, if you want to support the channel and you want to support them, head over to Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. And so the two concepts that I want to talk about in proportionality are two concepts that I want to talk about in tension are proportionality and utility. And it's strange to say that both of these things, or maybe strange to hear, apologies, that both of these things are an excellent way, if left in isolation, on how to become not just the villain or antagonist of somebody else's story, but actually an immoral actor. Proportionality is the easier one, we might say, while the use of force that we use, whether it's in self-defense or in warfare, ought be proportionate to the justification that the situation might pertain to. In other words, if I end up in if I am out in town and I receive something as simple as a slap to the face, it's not appropriate to immediately pull out a sword and chop them in half, so to speak. Honor be damned, I say, in this sense. But the issue that we talk about this is it's not so caricatured through human history as maybe film or some forms of what do you call it? Media maybe have presented it. I'm being purposely vague because I don't have an excellent example, but you can think of the way certain scenarios are talked about, or even how the differentiation between a cultural norm, which is a series of expectations that sometimes do have a governing role over proportionality within the context of that culture, or rather, as we're getting into this and as we're talking about it, we might want to think about it in other ways too. I think it was Dirty Civilian who recently put together a video on one of the motivations for being prepared is so that in the event that there is societal unrest or even something as simple as collapse, you do not default to being the bad guy. Now, of course, you can go throughout human history or even, philosophy and theology for the last couple hundred years and even further, really, and try to start with the question, is mankind basically good or basically evil? But this question isn't so much of a gotcha as a way of framing how we think about the world. Quite simply, you don't have to teach children how to do the wrong thing. You do have to teach them how to act correctly. And then religious studies, particularly that about Christianity, address things like the sin nature and how mankind in rebellion against God has brought evil into the world. But all of these things will come into effect when we think about proportionality. And so when we talk about war, we might talk about the appropriate use of force. And appropriateness is I don't want to call it a spectrum, but it's a sort of measurement that isn't as exact as we would like to be something like mathematics, at least not always. There might be certain cases where we have examples where the appropriate amount of force can be measured to the man or to the amount of violence wielded, but in the relationships between people, whether it's on the battlefield or in public, it isn't quite as simple. The line between peace and conflict between people isn't as easily defined as we would like it to be. Take, for example, the classic bar fight. Shouting or bumping and shouting turn to shoving, turn to maybe more shoving, turns to punching, turns to, who knows, a broken beer bottle, a pulled out dagger, or something of that sort. It's the escalation you might have to ask is, when did it exactly become a conflict or a fight? And we might be as simple as saying, well, it was when the first man shoved the other man. But unfortunately, those who have been in conflict know that it's very rarely that simple. We oftentimes know when the switch has been flipped from not fighting to fighting, but it doesn't mean that everyone and every outsider and every person involved in that conflict will be in agreement on it. So proportionality is something that we are morally concerned about when it comes to self-defense. But let's take just the first John Wick movie. Now, it might be a meme on the internet about how a person might value their dog's life than, say, the attacker of their dog. And there is some reasonableness to that, but would it be appropriate to cause death to the entire family? Now we get a little bit strayed. The story of John Wick, at least in the first movie, isn't really the clear-cut case of a heroic vigilante, but rather a course of vengeance which oftentimes stretches beyond what would be proportionate. Now, we are also setting this film in a crime syndicate, which has certain norms as well. And there's a certain understanding that there is no higher authority that can be reasonably applied to, and that grievances of certain sorts do, in fact, justify a certain use of force. Now, how does the story of John Wick begin? Well, I think if I remember correctly, there is the dog, the break-in, the car. But I think at some point in time, many of the characters involved in the story initiate conflict, and so don't take that with too much weight. Do not make that the center of this discussion. Rather, we have to look at proportionality in conflict or in tension with utility, which sometimes might be described as pragmatism. So let's say we use another example that there is a conflict between two countries, two groups of people. You can call them countries or gangs or whatever, but let's say the conflict is such that the war, whatever this war is the sort of highest level of adjudication that they are able to engage in, and even to some extent negotiations have fallen through. But let's say one army has effectively routed the other army. They have done so much. They have through strategy effectively defeated the other enemy, even though the other enemy is not entirely aware of this yet. Let's say the generals have quit or something like that. The generals have quit and the peace deals are being signed, and there's still some fighting on the Western Front. If you know the book or the book and to some extent the movie, you know the reference. But the issue here is then, would it be justified for the winning army to effectively butcher the losing army, or the army that lost? Would this change if the army that lost was also the army that initiated the conflict? Would this change if the people who are being eradicated are not directly involved with the conflict, but are, let's say, bound by blood, and the concern is to prevent the likelihood or possibility of ongoing conflict between the peoples by clearing house between one group, clearing house of one entire group? Well, of course, we might jump to quick conclusions and say, but no, genocide is not acceptable. And you would be right to begin that assumption. But genocide is not so simple an idea that it just kind of is and people want it. Rather, we would have to ask the question, how do people get there? Which is what we will work on in the conclusion, which, as we will discover, is a motivation and a reason why we ought be versed and somewhat trained in the use of force. And so the issue at hand, this tension, is between utility, the utility of eradication, and the proportionality of an appropriate response in conflict, exists throughout conflict, whether it's between individuals or on the war scale. And it exists on that level not only because both of them bear certain moral axioms, but bear certain moral convictions, not axioms, apologies, but that those convictions, those weights, have to balance for each other or with each other. If you have pure utilitarianism, then the only way to ensure peace would be to eradicate basically all life and anything that could possibly oppose you. But as it needs very little explanation, such a mentality ranges from megalomania to solipsism. It's a mania of sorts. And the challenge with utility and the way to solve for utility in this kind of case is to, in a sense, challenge it on a different context. How many people need to die in order to save how many potential lives? Or how much carnage is purely justified, or is required to achieve a certain utilitarian end? And we find very quickly that it becomes the same question or a similar question as to, well, if I break this dam, I might save or potentially improve the livelihoods of this many people, but it will come at the expense of that many people. And you have a much more complicated problem like the trolley problem. But the other side of the issue of proportionality, and the other side, the issue of proportionality itself is more or less when proportionality gets corrupted. Now, the corruption of utility is might makes right. We understand that there must be some utility to our actions. This form of utility oftentimes informs tactics and techniques, but it's not the same thing as moral adjudication or moral righteousness. On the same time, proportionality can be corrupted, particularly when dishonest actors and dishonest judges are making different claims about what is proportionate according to their ulterior motives. And you would say, well, it's only proportional. This is an example. The proportion it is not proportional for a police officer to use lethal force when he is defending his life against somebody else who is attempting to use lethal force because of that person's social background. The victim in this story is defaulted to the person who loses, and thus proportionality is thrown out the window. Proportionality is only capable of being judged if we view people as equals. You cannot measure proportionality in an equity world where people are not viewed as equals by their nature of being human, but that they should be made equal by the will of man. And so both of these problems have corruptions. Both of these concepts, which exist in tension with one another, have ways of being corrupted. What are other ways that you could corrupt utility? Well, might makes right is the easiest way, or it is easier to eradicate a people than to attempt to negotiate peace between warring parties. And so the utility of it is it's no longer concerned about whether the actions are moral themselves, but rather that the outcome is moral. And then the corruption of proportionality is so concerned or disrupted that it is no longer interested in true proportionality, but sets the grounds of proportionality on something other than the human life being involved. And so a simple corruption of proportionality in, say, a war is that the lives of innocents are considered the same. The lives of non-combatants are considered as jeopardized as the lives of combatants, which you would say what's an example? Would Dresden be an example? Would Nagasaki and Hiroshima be an example? Would the utility of breaking the will of the Japanese people be justified even if it has to come at the great loss of life? And there is a place where this tension can be seen front and center, and that is, if I drop this bomb, it will end this war, and if I end this war, this many fewer people, particularly innocents, will die, or this many fewer people will die, period. And so there was an argument made that dropping the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was effectively the moral action because it was preventing it was putting a stop to future conflict through a great display of force. But I think there is more to that story, more to that moral situation than can be simply evaluated in the remaining time we have for today. So let's look at application of this concept. There is a consistency amongst people who are not versed in the use of force, who have little to no experience of the use of force, to not understand proportionality. We talked about proportionality as a measure of appropriateness, and appropriateness is something that is best, if not only, really learned through some form of experience. It doesn't mean that a person must experience a violent gunfight to understand proportionality. Rather, it's that it's not something that can be purely learned, or very rarely can be purely learned in an abstract format. There has to be some development. It's a growth process. It is an understanding, like speaking a language or being able to play music or be able to understand certain social mores or certain social norms. It just doesn't always come naturally, and it's not as simple as analyzing it in a purely, let's call it, philosophical way. And so where we see this go wrong, and where we see this go wrong often, are when, what do we see in contemporary culture? We have current events going on. We have these campus protests on we have these protests on campus, or we have a complete a complete lack of understanding of asymmetrical warfare, where there might be a sort of but two sidesism to the conflict between Israel and Hamas, and Israel and Gaza and the Palestinians, and yet at the same time, the claims that are being made by both, the desired outcomes that are being stated by both and presented by both, are not necessarily the same. Now, don't get me wrong, it would be inappropriate to consider a barely literate college student on a campus to be the spokesperson for all of Palestine. The hubris being found there can be well understood from a distance. But the issue that's being said is, how is it that you have these students and people who turn out not to be students at all that are willing to chant things that essentially that directly claim for the eradication of a people by basis of ethnicity? How is it that they are capable of holding this to be true? Are they just patently evil people who actually do want that much evil? In some cases, potentially so. This idea of chanting from the river to the sea isn't mysteriously some sort of peace cry. It is a phrase that is used to justify the genocide of a population, or the complete eradication of a population. The goals as demonstrated by execution between the conflict in Israel is not symmetrical. They might both have some conflict over the land, and they might have some conflict over, or they might have conflict over who has rights to the land, but one is not, only one side's goal, as being presented along this argument, is the complete eradication of the other. Some forms of evidence on it is, if Israel wanted to, they probably could just delete Gaza without any concern for civilians, but they still haven't done this. But why are we talking about this in the measure of proportionality? Well, people understand proportionality by learning about the use of force. They learn about the use of force by understanding it and its capability and their capabilities as well. They learn proportionality through training. Now, does that mean that every person who receives training is going to go out and commit atrocities? No. In fact, it's quite the inverse. The concept of proportionality is developed through training, and that training, it's not universally. You can say this in certain countries that are, if the stated goal of the country is the genocide of another country, then no, you don't see proportionality in their training. But insofar as we see, particularly in America and particularly in the West, the motivation and the result of training is a method, is the restraint that we talk about in proportionality. And that is something that we would want to keep and maintain as a gun culture. Now, instead of this being a searing dagger to throw at all our internet enemies and create an internet fight. It rather is a lesson in how we think about the appropriateness of the use of force in the environments that we land in, so that in the event that we are going to use force, we have already considered the moral implications of that action and are willing to use force for good cause. Now, that does not come about by simply believing that one is the victim. It does not come about by seeing as oneself as the righteous side in all of one's circumstances. Rather, that comes about by humbling oneself to understand and learn what the moral conditions for the use of force might be. And I don't believe that that can truly be accomplished absent some form of training. If you think an example that a cop, a police officer who's under duress and being attacked by a man with, let's say, a machete, that he could just fall out for, VATS, pause, slow time, and simply shoot the man in the arm and then restrain him afterwards. If you think that, then you don't understand violence enough to be participating in a public conversation about it, and it is a responsibility to subject oneself to true education by those who are skilled in it, not by your political allies. So, and that allies word is such a cultist word. There it goes. I invited something and then closed the invitation. So, in closing, in summary, proportionality is a measure of appropriateness that involves the restraint of force. That means a person could do more, an army could do more, a soldier, a platoon, a company could do more force. They could use greater violence than what they are doing, and they are capable of measuring that proportionality by understanding how far they can go and choosing only to meet the amount of force with the appropriate amount of response. That concept of proportionality is in tension with the utility that can be corrupted in a might makes right scenario. But utility plays its role in how we devise tactics, techniques, and strategies. And so, if you want to develop a better sense of appropriateness, the recommendation is to engage in training, whether that's ECQC, jiu-jitsu, or self-defense, and particularly force-on-force training, which is available quite a few places. And with that, we're going to close. So if you appreciate this and if you've got comments on other ways to increase one's measure of appropriateness, leave it down below. If not, you can find us at redactedllc.com. And with that, go forth and conquer.